So I welcome, I think we are live now. A very good afternoon to all of you who have joined through their devices on today's webcast, which is on RTI, the differential diagnosis, treatment, and practical approach during this global pandemic of COVID 19. And to enrich our experience on this particular topic, we have three experts with us today who are going to basically take you through their own journey of how they're handling, how they're managing, how they're treating and diagnosing the disease. So, to start with, I'll first like to introduce the moderator for today's session, Dr. Bharat Jagyasi, who currently is the HOD for the Department of Critical Care Medicine in Reliance Hospital, Navi Mumbai. He's also the secretary of the Mumbai chapter of ISCCM, and he is the joint secretary of the ISCCM headquarters. Over to you, sir. Without much ado, I would like to hand over the session to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Arun. Thanks for introducing me. And as you all said, this webinar is totally based on the COVID. So we have the two distinguished speakers with me. One is Dr. Ashish Hegde. Everyone knows him. He's from Hinduja Hospital, consultant intensive care unit. And also he's going to speak on the treatment modalities in COVID, and he's going to share his own experience. Then we have another esteemed faculty with us, Dr. Agam Vora. He's very well-renowned chest physician. He's going to mostly speak on the respiratory tract infections in the COVID times. So Dr. Agam, everyone knows he's a chest physician and practices in Shushit Hospital, Cooper. So sir, over to you, just to have a let us know regarding the respiratory infections which we should be looking during the Corona time. All right.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Bye for that nice words of introduction. Thank you, Dr. Ashish Hegde, for being there. And Ashish is going to be looking after the difficult part of today's program, and he's going to be talking about COVID. And I'm going to be talking about simple part of today's program, and that is going to be respiratory tract infections. Trust me, during the pandemic times, we must think of the ongoing infection. In the sense, whenever you get any patient of influenza-like presentation, you must think of Corona first. It's like we were just discussing. It's like in Mumbai, in India, if you get fever with chills, first thing you will have is malaria in mind, because India is endemic for malaria. If you have any patient with 1 month history of cough, with weight loss, with hemoptysis, you will think of TB first, unless proved otherwise. Similarly, in today's time, whenever you have a short onset of respiratory symptom, think of Corona. With that, I would tell you what I have probably kind of developed my kind of algorithm to diagnose or suspect various other illnesses with Corona, and have to give you some idea about what kind of infections or what kind of bacterial infection that I am seeing in practice of late. I must thank Arun Sharma of India Bulls for arranging this program, and of course India Bulls for hosting this program. And I thank all of you who spared your valuable time to join us. There is so much of information on Corona everywhere, and still you decided to be with us. It's an honor for us. I wish that all of us please fold your hands and pray for the departed soul. We have almost 3 lakhs lives lost globally in last couple of months. More than 3,000 deaths in our country last couple of months because of this deadly virus. And I'm sure God is going to give us strength. God is going to give us extra blessings to come out of this particular time. And I take this opportunity to salute each one of you for joining hands in fight against this deadly virus that is Corona. Before I begin, I got this WhatsApp message about Churchill in World War II times. And he said, never let a good crisis go waste. And every crisis, every situation has lessons hidden. He said, even COVID-19, if you really look at that, COVID-19, though tragically killed many lives worldwide, it has altered the global scenario. What he said that time about World War II, I think if we relate it to today's time, we'll realize it is a time to change our lifestyle. It is a time to slow down when not required. Travel only if required. Stop taking kids to unnecessary places like mall. Instead, spend time with them at home. Attend to personal hygiene more vigorously. Pray. avoid eating outside, restore your health, learn cooking at home. And I can very confidently tell you that I can manage edible food. I can manage a little bit of food, read books instead of watching those boring movies at cinemas. Economy may slow down, but such crisis opens up new opportunities, and it's only the matter of time. Stop weekend outings and let environment restore itself. At times, nature puts things in order. We just need to obey it. How true it was. And at this stage, I must express my sincere thanks to my teacher, late Professor Director Dr. K.C. Mohanty, for making me worth here to be in front of you. When the organizers contacted me about Agam, we have to do this program on 16th May. I told Dr. Bharat, 16th May, Saturday afternoon, 3-3:30 baje ka. He said, no, 16th May is a very precious day, very important day. It's a very historical day. I said, Acha, kya hua? And Dr. Bharat sent me this message. It says, on the same day, 16th May, 1996, Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji became 10th Prime Minister of our country. That's interesting. In 1975, on the same day, Sikkim became 22nd state of India. And not only that, even internationally, 2013, stem cells from cloned human embryos for the first time, they were extracted. It is Armed Force Day. It is Matrice Day of Sudan. It's the Mass Graves Day in Iraq. It's a National Day of South Sudan and Teachers Day of Malaysia. I said, wow. So what? And he says, you know what Steve Jobs said? Steve Jobs in 2007, when he was introducing iPhone for the first time, all those people who gathered there, he said, thank you for coming. We are going to make some history together today. And who knows, today, after Dr. Hegde's talk, today, after my probably 15 minutes of sharing of experience, our outlook to disease may change. And you and me together may create history. Because things may not be as it appears always. You can see that. This picture, I mean, unluckily, we are not face to face. Otherwise, I would have asked you all to raise hands and probably tell me what you see in picture. But my experience says that most of the times when we look at this picture, a thought comes to mind that it is a deer which is crossing the road. But if you really look at it, this is not actually deer crossing the road, but it is road which is crossing jungle. This picture I took a decade ago when I was going through Kaziranga forest. In Kaziranga, I think I was going from, I was somewhere in Assam, and from there I was going by road and I crossed Kaziranga forest, and this was actually the road which was crossing jungle. With that, let me present to you what is my personal experience in last couple of months. I kind of gathered last 100 patients which I saw in OPD in last 3 months for infections. And of that, I had about 12 people belonging to upper respiratory tract infection, and rest were at lower respiratory tract infection. Amongst this lower respiratory tract infection, 7 had healthy lung and rest were with unhealthy lung. That means about 80% were unhealthy lung, and more than 76% of my patient population belonged to elderly population. What do you mean by unhealthy lung? Let me clear it out that I am a chest physician practicing in Mumbai for more than 2 decades, and hence most of my patients who would come to me would be with underlying unhealthy lung, or all those my patients who come for regular follow-up for their acute problems they've seen me. Scenario at a family physician's level could be different, but this is what I am seeing. I am seeing majority of my patients are COPD patients who come to me for infection. I see a lot of my patients belong to interstitial lung disease who come to me for infection. Patients on immunosuppressive therapies for variety of disorders. A few cases of asthma. There may be bronchiectasis, post-tuberculous sequelae lung. I had few patients of liver transplant, and I had patients of recurrent respiratory tract infection. There are some patients, in spite of we are not able to identify any particular immunocompromising situation, may still get recurrent respiratory tract infection. I'm going to talk about that. When I look at what kind of bacteria I am seeing in my OPD, I am seeing most of them gram-positive streptococcal infection. There are a few having atypical infection. Time and again, you may come across no bugs, in the sense you know it is bacterial infection, you've done all possible precautions, but then still you're not able to identify bugs. It may so happen if patient is initiated on antibiotics earlier, it may so happen that your sputum collection techniques or your the lab facilities may not be good enough. You may see gram-negative bugs with underlying unhealthy lung. When it comes to COPD and interstitial lung disease, you may see even gram-negative bugs. Difficult bugs like Pseudomonas and Klebsiella could also be there. And never forget, tuberculosis is always there. So whenever there is infection, even if it is acute infection, keep tuberculosis as differential, because in one of my other study for community-acquired pneumonias, I had about 3 to 4% pickup of tuberculosis. In the sense, patient presented with acute illness, had a consolidation with neutrophilic predominance, but on investigation, on bronchoscopy, they were sputum positive. When I looked at last 100 ILI, that is influenza-like illness, and I found I had 12 COVIDs. In the sense, only 12%, if you have to put it that way, were COVID, and one patient required ICU admission. The rest all probably were managed either at probably quarantine or at the nursing home level. Surprisingly, I had about 15 influenza, 11 influenza A and 4 influenza B. I could pick up 3 rhinovirus. In fact, first 5 patients where I suspected COVID and I sent, none of them turned COVID, and they had influenza A, B, and rhinovirus. 26 patients out of 100, I did not ask for test because clinically I was suspecting asthma in them. In 7, I had GRDS suspicion, and a few psychological. You can imagine there is a lockdown going on. So many people are at home for so many days. There are issues with interpersonal relation. There are financial issues, fear, insecurity. A lot of things could get you psychological disturbances and then present with influenza-like illnesses. In spite of good investigations, fairly decent investigations, 11, again, I could not find any bugs. And I thought they were probably due to allergy, probably due to irritations, probably due to unidentifiable otherwise causes. 16 bacteria, that is streptococci, 4 atypicals, and 1 tuberculosis. Tuberculosis you will always find. That means if you look at it, about 20% had a bacterial infection and about around 20-25% influenza. And hence, probably whenever it is influenza-like illness, that means a short-term majority of this patient will have viral infections, of which if you see influenza is common, influenza I'm seeing more common even in today's time, COVID time, I saw more influenza A and B put together. Whenever you are in OPD or whenever you see such patients, your concerns are, is it lower respiratory tract or upper respiratory tract infection? If patient has got more of facial symptoms, patient has got more of nasal stuffiness, nasal discharges, headaches, earaches, and throat, probably you're talking about upper respiratory tract infection. But when it comes to yellowish greenish sputum, when it comes to breathlessness, when it comes to chest pain, when it comes to heaviness of chest, or whenever it comes to systemic involvement, you're probably talking about lower respiratory tract infection. The next question will come to mind is it bacterial or is it viral? If you have more of cold, sneezing, if you have more of prodromal phase, if you have a little bit of body ache, weakness, lethargy, you're probably talking about viral. But when it is cough, fever with chills, yellowish green sputum, you're talking about bacterial infection, but not uncommon for viral infection to get secondarily infected. So you have a prodromal phase, patient feels better, and again starts deteriorating, probably was viral to begin with, and now patient has got secondary bacterial infection. What would you treat with? Antibiotics or antivirals depends on what you're suspecting. If it is bacterial, or probably if you're looking at influenza, you may think of treating this patient with oseltamivir. Indoor or outdoor, most of these patients, if stable, can be managed on OPD basis. In the sense, if you have a young patient, if you have an adult patient with no comorbidities, patient doesn't have hypertension, diabetes, patient not very breathless, patient is not in hypotension, probably all these patients can be managed on OPD basis. Patients who have underlying COPD, bronchiectasis, diabetes, kidney failure, transplant recipients, all those patients must be managed in hospital. Whenever patient has hypotension, whenever patient has high-grade fever, whenever you have CBCM, probably there is marked leukocytosis or leukopenia, wherever there are signs of dehydration, whenever urea is elevated, whenever patient is breathless and cannot complete one sentence in one breath, is toxic, you would probably be at advantage in admitting him in the hospital. What further test, how many days of antibiotics and which route, again depends on whether you kept him in hospital or in the OPD basis. In the OPD basis, most of the times you would be fine with about 7 or 10 days of antibiotics. A lot of my patients, a lot of my friends ask me, how do you clinically differentiate corona, cold, flu, and seasonal allergies? And trust me, there is no single way to differentiate this. Still, there is a particular situation may help you suspect a particular thing, say corona. In today's time, any influenza like presentation, one would suspect coronavirus, especially if there is fever, especially if patient has got fatigue, cough usually is dry, there are aches and pains sometimes, generally there is no sneezing, generally there is no running of nose and stuffing of nose. Couple of them do complain about diarrhea. There may be some patients complaining of headaches, and there may be shortness of breath in severe cases. When it comes to seasonal allergies, if there is associated asthma, patient will complain of breathlessness. But otherwise, most of these patients will have fatigue, cough, and sneezing. There may be some running of nose, and usually there is aches and pains and diarrhea, sore throat are absent. When it comes to flu, there is influenza. When it comes to that swine flu, bird flu, another type of type of that, it is generally abrupt onset of symptoms, and it is seen in that season. Of course, India has got round the year season, and with a lot of traveling across the globe possible, except for this lockdown, you would otherwise expect flu to happen round the year. But fever is common there. Fatigue sometimes. There is no sneezing generally. Diarrhea is not common. Sore throat is not very common. Running of nose is not very common. So that is your flu. When it comes to cold, there is generally gradual onset of symptoms, and then there is hardly any fever, and there are mainly nasal symptoms, that is sneezing, body aches, running of nose, stuffing nose, and sore throat, etc. is common. There is no diarrhea. There is no shortness of breath. So with this, if you are enough confused, this is what I would tell you.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Agam.
That means you may get confused even after years of understanding, even after months of experience of managing this infection. Of course, corona is going to be taken up by Dr. Ashit. He will tell us about corona in detail. But it began probably in the last week of December, and we, in less than about month's time, had the first case of coronavirus in Kerala, presents with fever, malaise, dry cough, and less common symptoms, as we said, breathlessness only in small proportion of patients, with about average duration of probably active monitoring of about 14 days, because incubation period average about 5.1 days, where majority of patients would develop symptoms in about 12 days time. When I talk about infections, LRTIs, a global scenario is worldwide there are 13.1% of all deaths in younger children and 4.4% of all deaths of all ages. The greatest number in children is less than 5 years, occurs in South Asia. Pneumococcal pneumonia is the leading cause of LRTI. And then comes the RSV virus, followed by H influenza. When it comes to global 5 major respiratory conditions, you can see COPD, third one is acute respiratory infections, and TB, 3 belonging to infection category across the globe. India, about 20% accounts for mortality among various infectious agents due to lower respiratory tract infections. And if you look at the Delhi, that is disability adjusted life years, it has rose in last 20 years from 4.5 to 6.4, and huge 28.1 million in 1990 to 55.3 million cases of COPD in India in last 20 years. LRTI would be pneumonia, acute exacerbation of chronic bronchitis, acute exacerbation of bronchiectasis, and acute bronchitis are various studies. And we don't have data about most of these infections, but we believe that about 20% of these episodes of pneumonia, 36% of total WHO pneumonia comes in this Southeast Asia, and about 20% of them are serious. We have no definition of what is recurrent respiratory tract infection. And we believe when it comes to pneumonia, 2 or more episodes of radiologically documented pneumonia in 1 year is defined as recurrent pneumonia. And if we extrapolate that, we believe that 3 or more annual episodes of bronchiectasis, bronchiolitis, or pneumonia can be defined as recurrent respiratory tract infection. Poor immunity, inadequate antibiotics, environmental factors, ineffective clearance of mucus, chronic infections, cardiovascular abnormalities could be few risk factors. Inadequate antibiotic therapy, about 50% of all antibiotic prescriptions aim at treatment of upper respiratory tract infections are probably wrong. For most of these upper respiratory tract infections. Viral or bacterial, when it comes to COPD, most of these patients, about almost 50% of the acute exacerbations are bacterial, And influenza A and B could be associated with only 8% of exacerbation. In fact, in recent times, we have seen around the same 4 to 5% of exacerbations are due to COVID infection. And A COPD is associated with respiratory virus. There may be probably secondary bacterial infections in COPD in time to come. What investigations would you do? CBC, chest X-ray, CT scan, sputum test. There is sputum gene expert test available, cultures available, swab for biofire available, swab for COVID available, and one must do certain tests to assess the host factor, immunity factor, that is sugars, HIV, etc. Look at again a very interesting message. We have to be very choosy in doing our test. If you do 1 lakh COVID test per day, with population of 138 crores, if you have to do each and every patient with 1 lakh test, it would take 37 years from today to complete testing entire country. And forget, on top of that, you will need, if it is only 1 test done and population is static, that means population doesn't increase, this is going to be seen. And hence, this is what I recommend. Before ordering the test, one must decide what you will do if test is positive or negative. If answers are the same, don't ask for the test. I have developed that habit in OPD that if patient is not having many risk factors, patient is otherwise stable, you may not actually ask for COVID test. And in today's time, treat all patients as COVID suspect. That means tell them about the standard hygiene, tell them about standard wearing of mask, tell them about social distancing, and you may avoid doing that test. These are classical patterns of CT scans or radiology. You can see that probably, there is a bat wing kind of a sign on CT scan with organization and fibrosis happening both sides. You could see that crazy paving pattern, which are standard diagnostic radiological feature of that we said are underlying airway obstruction, presence of comorbidities, home oxygen, chronic steroid use, hypercapnia, etc. And these are a few of the steps that I would probably talk about when it comes to effective antibiotic use. Do ask yourself a question: is antibiotic indicated on clinical grounds? Most of this infection may be viral, and you don't really need to treat them with antibiotics. Are appropriate investigations performed? You will do minimum possible investigations in OPD, but when it comes to indoor patients, when it comes to serious patients, you may have to do a lot of tests. What organisms cause this particular infection? You must suspect it is gram positive, gram negative. Do you need to cover up for atypical? Which agent? Gram positive drug, gram negative drug, or drug with anti coverage or atypical bugs? You may want to treat with single antibiotic or a combination antibiotic. Host factors one has to keep in mind. If there is say associated diabetes, uncontrolled diabetes, you may be a little cautious in giving quinolones. Quinolones may give rise to hypoglycemia and things like that. The route of administration, appropriate dose, lab results. You must modify your reports after lab reports and give adequate duration treatment. In the end, I would say that look at the total number of deaths daily. Daily, due to tuberculosis in India, we are losing about 600 to 900 patients. Due to COPD, we are losing over 2,000 patients daily. Due to diabetes, we are losing about 2,500 patients daily. Due to heart disease, we are losing about 7,000 patients daily. And this is worldwide data where tuberculosis, hepatitis, pneumonia, malaria, etc. are top causes of deaths worldwide. And we are fortunate that in our country, only probably nearly about 3,000 people we have lost, but significant proportion of patients out of this, we could help them. So there is no reason to panic, but every reason to take precautions. And I would end my slide by saying that we had tough Valentine Day 2020, and probably if we want to have better 2021, we'll have to join hands to fight this particular infections. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Agam. Thanks for that talk, and it's really informative, and you told us what exactly is to be done and not to be done if there is a respiratory tract infection. Now we'll move to the second speaker, Dr. Ashit Hegde. Everyone knows him. He's a consultant and physician in intensive care in Hinduja Hospital, and he's going to speak on the differential diagnosis and treatment modalities in COVID patients. Sir, over to you. Sir, you have to share your screen here. Hegde, sir, over to you.
No, hello. I actually don't have a formal presentation because I think that I'm frankly sick of webinars. I'm sure everybody else is sick of webinars. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes on COVID presentations and treatment, and probably more importantly, give enough time for questions. I really don't think formal presentations are required. Agam has covered most about what you need to do about COVID, but as he has said, in this period, anybody who comes with respiratory symptoms is suspect. You probably need to think about COVID, but you should also need to understand that COVID doesn't always present with respiratory symptoms. Quite often, people may just come with just weakness. They may come with very mild fever. They may not have any respiratory symptoms at all. And though he has said that running nose, blocked nose, etc., are rare, but it can sometimes happen. The present that the fact that they have a sneezing or a blocked nose doesn't necessarily rule out COVID. Also, quite often nowadays, COVID is presenting with a lot of atypical symptoms, which you need to make us aware. Quite often, it can present with just anosmia, lack of smell, lack of taste, conjunctivitis. GI symptoms are actually quite common in COVID. So actually, just recent onset of diarrhea or even any other gastrointestinal symptoms should make you think of suspecting COVID. Other things are in the elderly, especially they may come with just altered sensorium. Myocardial infarctions, especially in the younger people with no risk factors, quite often can be a manifestation of COVID because, especially you have somebody who's relatively young, has no known conventional risk factor. Because COVID is supposed to cause a program condition, strokes without risk factors can be a manifestation of COVID. Basically, it means that in this day, practically any new symptom, any new change in a patient's condition, anybody who suddenly becomes unwell, COVID becomes a factor in the differential diagnosis. Now, I understand it's not possible to test everybody, but why is it necessary to test, at least diagnose COVID in those whom you have? Because you probably need to identify their contacts. You need to at least quarantine those contacts. For how long to quarantine is a matter of controversy, but at least for 1 week, those contacts need to be quarantined because that is the only way you can probably try and limit the spread of the illness in the community. So though I agree, screening everybody who doesn't have symptoms may not be practical, as Agam said, but at least in the patients who have symptoms and in patients whom you think are likely to have COVID, it might be worthwhile testing them because at least in that situation, you can identify the close contacts, the patients, the ones whom you think are high risk contacts, and at least isolate and quarantine those contacts, and you might try and you might prevent those contacts from spreading the disease into the community wider. So that's one reason for testing. Now, which test do you do for COVID? Before actually doing testing, what other things of course, clinically, like I said, anybody coming unwell is likely of COVID. But what are the lab tests that might go more in favor of COVID? One, of course, is in the counts. Usually, there will be some amount of neutropenia, some amount of thrombocytopenia, not drastic, not like dengue or malaria, but little counts may be on the lower side. But what is important is quite often these people have lymphopenia. A lymphocyte count less than 1,000, absolute lymphocyte less than 1,000 is wrongly suggestive of COVID. And also it is said that if you look at the ratio of the neutrophils to the lymphocyte, the higher the ratio, the more likely this patient could have a severe outcome, the more likely the prognosis is going to be poor. The other lab tests, they quite often, kidney dysfunction at onset is quite common, especially in our country. So they can have renal dysfunction. The liver test may be abnormal. The other thing, of course, is the PCT, the procalcitonin is usually normal in patients with COVID. Of course, it's normal in most other viral illnesses as well. So PCT being positive generally goes against COVID unless, of course, the patient has secondary bacterial infection, which just doesn't happen upfront. So I think this is one more thing in the diagnosis, the WBC count, of course, the X-ray if it shows bilateral infiltrates, but you really don't always need an X-ray to do this thing. And of course, like I said, you need to do the specific test for diagnosing COVID, which is at the moment, the only test that we have is the PCR, which is a nasopharyngeal swab for the viral, for the PCR for the virus, which is pretty specific for COVID-19. Of course, the sensitivity is about 70% because quite often this is more related to the technique in which it is if the swab is taken, not necessarily because of the deficiency of the test itself. But for all practical purposes, it's about 70% sensitive, which basically means that if your suspicion is very strong, you might actually have to repeat the PCR test after a day or so to confirm your suspicion. In the future, we might have antibody tests. Antibody tests, especially if somebody after 8 or 9 days of symptoms, and if the antibody test, you can have both an IgM and IgG like you have for dengue and other things. If they are positive, tells you that this patient is likely to have had COVID recently, but it doesn't tell you that the patient is no longer contagious to others. So it just tells you that this patient has probably recently had an attack of COVID, but doesn't tell you much about whether it's safe to ask him to mix with others. That doesn't tell you. For that, you still need to do an RT-PCR or a certain duration from the first symptoms, about 9 to 10 days after symptoms are when, by and large, people are unlikely to be then shedding virus. So that's really more important than the antibody test. Antibody, of course, tells you in people who are, it helps with faster tests, cheaper tests. So that from that point of view, it might be beneficial. But that's about all. But it's not as specific as the, as this antigen test. Now, when it comes to treatment for COVID-19, honestly, COVID-19 is like any other respiratory virus, actually has no definitely proven treatment. The treatment for COVID-19 at the moment, the only evidence-borne treatment is that you treat them good supportive care. All the other treatments that have been postulated are all at the moment not evidence, they're all under trial. So they all have to be ideally being done in the context of a trial. No medicine has at the moment to be shown to be effective beyond doubt. They're all experimental at the moment. Anything that we give is only experimental. There is not enough evidence to say that this drug is effective. But what are the likely drugs? What are the potential medicines that can be used? Of course, you have what are called the antiviral drugs, you have the anti-inflammatory drugs, you have the antibodies, and then you have plasma therapy. I'll talk very, very briefly about each of them. Like I said, I'll probably give more time for the actual questions. So the antiviral drugs, the most important of which is remdesivir, which is in one study in the US showed some potential benefit. Still not available in our country, probably an expensive drug, but it might help reduce the duration of symptoms, but not yet shown to improve mortality, but might help reduce the duration of symptoms. Like we use oseltamivir for H1N1, it probably will be the most effective if used early on. Probably using it later on might not be as beneficial. Probably, therefore, if we decide to use it, we need to use it in people who are supposed to be at high risk. And who are these people at high risk? Essentially, of course, the elderly. We all know that the higher the age, the more the risk of developing severe symptoms. And if you have comorbidities, chiefly hypertension, ischemic heart disease, diabetes, obesity. So in these patients, if you would like to start remdesivir when and when it's available, you probably need to start it earlier rather than when they go on to develop full-blown symptoms. The other antiviral drugs also like favipiravir from Japan, again experimental. Then we had studies are being done on lopinavir, ritonavir, again not evidence-based yet, and one or two studies have been disappointing. Oseltamivir has no role in the treatment of COVID. It only has a role in the treatment of H1N1, other influenza-like viruses. But sometimes patients have co-infections. In that situation, especially if you run a biofire or something else, you're suspecting co-infection, only then will oseltamivir help. Otherwise, oseltamivir has no role itself for the treatment of COVID-19. So that's about the antiviral drugs. Then, of course, about the anti-inflammatory drugs. Chloroquine actually has several potential modes of action, and chloroquine and HCQ, which is supposed to be the safer, version of chloroquine. It is supposed to prevent attachment of the virus to the epithelium in the bronchus. After that, it's supposed to have a moderate anti-inflammatory action, antiviral action, which is why chloroquine has captured everybody's imagination, chloroquine and HCQ. But though the initial reports seem to be very suggestive, and though our governments exported chloroquine to all over the world, recent reports seem to suggest that it is not as great as it's made out to be. There was a recent review in the NEJM which suggested that maybe it doesn't make a difference in outcome. So at the moment, though we still use it, we still this is again, like I said, this is experimental. There is no hardcore evidence. We have in fact stopped using HCQ and chloroquine in our ICU because we don't think the risk benefit ratio is worth it. But of course, several other ICUs are using it, and at the moment, the evidence either for or against is both equivocal. So if you wish to, you can use it. If you don't use it, there is no big deal. The other inflammatory drug, of course, is steroids. Steroids, of course, is everybody's very popular drug. Everybody likes to use steroids. But steroids, again, can be a double-edged sword. They are, again, like I said, not evidence-based. Obviously, if you use steroids too early in a viral pneumonia, they might actually increase viral growth and might actually delay the clearance of the virus. So obviously, it should not be used early on. Definitely not. The question is whether you can use it once this patient start developing, worsening of the pneumonia. That's roughly about a week after the onset of the symptoms. This is the time when some patients develop a so-called inflammatory response to the virus and go on to develop pneumonia. This is the situation where maybe, like I said, this again is not evidence-based, but there is a theoretical rationale for using moderate doses of steroids for a limited period of time. Again, I'm saying it's a moderate dose of steroids, generally about 1 milligram per kilogram of methylprednisolone for probably not more than a week. That might be the time when it can be used. Not probably longer, not definitely in higher doses, because once you use it for longer or use it for higher doses, then the risk-benefit ratio, the risk of secondary infection, risk of myopathy, neuropathy might outweigh any potential benefit. So that's when, so steroids might be in selective cases, but very cautiously in a cautious, modest dose and for a short period of time. The other drugs that have been tried are the monoclonal antibodies, tocilizumab especially. This again is used only in the ICU, especially in patients who go on to develop what's called a severe cytokine storm. As they progress into the illness, they can develop, the virus causes a release a lot of cytokines, which causes a great severe inflammatory response. This can be diagnosed on the lab as a test of, some people do IL-6 levels, we can monitor CRP, we can monitor the D-dimer, lots of things that you can monitor. And on the basis of that, and if the patient is worsening, this is one place where you can use this monoclonal antibody. Of course, this downside of a monoclonal antibody is that because it suppresses immunity, these patients are more vulnerable to secondary bacterial infection. Therefore, you need to watch them very, very closely for development of secondary bacterial infections. At the same time, when it comes for the other thing that might be used, quite often it's been shown that COVID-19 causes a very procoagulant condition. Many of these patients have a high D-dimer to begin with itself. So almost everybody with COVID-19, unless it's a contraindication, merits prophylaxis in some form with heparin. And in fact, if the D-dimers are rising or going about a certain level, they probably need therapeutic treatment with anticoagulation. That's about the drug treatment. The other thing that has been used is, of course, plasma therapy. Plasma therapy, there was one study in JAMA which said there were 5 patients, it was from China, where 5 patients who got plasma from patients who had recovered from COVID. And the outcome in these 5 patients is very good, which is why now several countries have approved plasma from patients who have recovered. Usually should be about 28 days since they have recovered from the COVID, then their plasma is collected. It is thought that these plasma will contain antibodies which will help the patient fight against COVID. So this is something, again, at the moment, it is still comes within experimental therapy. It can be used only within the freeze of an IC of a trial. It cannot be used routinely, randomly, but as part of a trial, plasma therapy has been approved even in our country. So these are some of the therapies that have been, used in COVID. What are the other things that we do for managing these patients? Obviously, the most important thing, but people must remember that these patients quite often clinically have what is called as happy hypoxia, which basically means that, they breathe rapidly. They're breathing at 35, 40 times a minute, but they don't seem to be in respiratory distress. The Ehlers Danlos are not flaring, the sternocleidomastoid muscle is not contracting, the diaphragmatic muscle, there is no paradox, but they are tachypneic. Also, quite often they are desaturating. So it's almost probably mandatory in anybody with the COVID to actually do a pulse oximeter, because if the saturation is less than 95, they may seem very well, but if the saturation is less than 95 in room A, they probably need to be admitted for observation, because they can go down very, very quickly. And even in centers where they're kept in quarantine, the probably pulse oximetry needs to be measured at least twice a day, because these patients may be asymptomatic even with hypoxia, and unless you do a pulse oximeter, you will not know that they're going to be, deteriorating quickly. But the treatment, obviously, if there is hypoxic, is oxygen. Many of them may respond only to simple oxygen. Another thing that helps them really is which can be done very simply, is making them turn prone. Even if they're awake, you can just ask them to sleep on their tummy. Quite often, this helps improve the hypoxia, often helps relieve the dyspnea. Even if some people are not very comfortable lying prone, sometimes just asking them to turn to one side, left lateral, right lateral, whichever improves the saturation, whichever improves dyspnea, also itself might be okay. Therefore, proning is the better thing. Sometimes even lateral position might be helpful. And by doing these things, you might help prevent worsening of the disease. You might help prevent intubation and mechanical ventilation. These are simple things that can be tried. But the most important thing is, of course, like I said, is that don't be misled by the fact that the patient doesn't seem to be in distress. Monitor the saturations at least twice a day. And then anybody with a saturation less than 95 and room air, even if he's comfortable, needs to be admitted. He can't be managed at home. And of course, anybody with comorbidities, even if they're okay, they obviously need to be admitted, because they can deteriorate rapidly. That is the main thing in COVID, that sometimes once they develop hypoxia, they deteriorate very, very quickly, and you don't have enough time to treat them, which is why you need to probably monitor them. So that's about I won't really talk too much about the intensive care aspects of COVID. Unless there are any specific questions, I shall be willing to answer those questions. This is a very brief talk. I think, like I said, I was concentrating more on giving you all time for questions. So Bharat, I think you can take over if there are any questions. Both of us will be willing to answer them. Like I said, this has been a very brief talk, but I am willing to answer questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thanks for the information. I think both of you have covered quite a good aspect of the COVID. So we'll go ahead with the questions, and we have the questions with us. So question one, Dr. Agam, it's for you. And obviously it's a tougher one, as you asked for.
Direct.
Should asthma patients continue their inhalational medicines, and which group of population is at the highest risk?
Excellent question, and I I think asthma patients should continue the treatment as prescribed. It is more important to control underlying disorder first. Even if they require steroids, oral steroids for other disease, not for asthma, say patient is of interstitial lung disease and is stable on a particular dose of oral steroids, do not change it. Please continue those steroids. This patient should take extra precautions. As we discussed, probably hand sanitization, social distancing, and wearing of mask is very important. None of these patients require N95 mask. Most of these patients would require only a simple triple layer mask. A good quality triple layer mask with filter is all that is required for these patients. So treatment of underlying disease must continue as it is. The second part of the question is, which population at a higher risk? Elderly patient and patient with any other comorbidities like uncontrolled diabetes, like underlying COPD, patient is on respiratory failure, patient is on oxygen therapy, patient is a transplant recipient, patient is on dialysis. All these patients are at a higher risk. So by and large, population will get equal, everybody has equal chance of getting it. Whether they would get a difficult disease depends on their host factors. In the sense, immunity would decide the outcome of disease. Thank you.
Yeah, so the next question is, it's again for you, Dr. Agam. Should every patient, even when not suffering from COVID, postpone the elective surgery? And I will like Dr. Akshay or Dr. Ashit also to take up this question. So I would like to have a dual view because
see, that's another interesting question. I think it's the time now we learn to live with Corona. This kind of social distancing or this kind of initial lockdown was mainly designed for us to adequately gear up, adequately prepare ourselves for the worst that we are going to see. If I'm not wrong, the number of cases are going to increase probably once the lockdown is open. You can imagine once the travel starts, once the rickshaws move, once the buses start, once the trains start, the kind of spread it would occur of the disease is quite understandable. And for how long we would keep ourselves in this lockdown, and what is non-emergency? Everything is required. I understand there could be a relative probably delay in doing this surgery, but I think it is the time we all do that. I have never understood. If I may ask Dr. Ashit Hegde, I have never understood why do we ask for this HIV also, and why do we ask for HBsAg also, and why do we ask for HCV? We are supposed to take equal care in all these patients. It is not that a patient is HIV positive, though we will wear gloves. If HIV, then we will wear this kind of. No, we are supposed to take care with each and every patient. I would say that probably it is the time we start taking due care, and you would treat every patient as Corona positive or high risk patient or patient who can spread infection and take care adequately. My wife is an anesthetist, and me and my wife daily have this fight going on, whether to take, get COVID testing done before surgery, etc. Now, in my opinion, of course, Ashit may have a different opinion, you may have Bharat a different opinion, but in my opinion, I believe there is no need for doing special tests. We are not yet geared up to do this kind of test, but we need to take adequate care in each and every patient. Dr. Hegde.
No, so I'll just answer this. 1 second. So for every patient you meant, we have to take it as a Corona positive patient even before the surgery. So that means every patient, each and everyone in the OT staff has to wear the N95 and shields?
Not really. Again, do you think that N95 mask is otherwise required for every patient? How many patients of tuberculosis you have seen without wearing mask? How many patients of influenza infections you have seen without ever bothering about wearing mask? Today also we lose about 5 lakhs patients because of influenza every year, in spite of having good vaccine, in spite of having decent herd immunity, in spite of having treatment for influenza available. Corona, probably we are going to have time to develop herd immunity. We are going to have time to develop medicine. We are going to have time to develop vaccines. So for next 2 years, if we avoid surgeries, how are we going to probably justify that? I think every patient should be given due care. We must take due precautions. Everybody did not wear N95 mask. Everybody, only the operating people, all those staffs and bosses and etc. sitting there did not wear N95 mask. There has to be enough air controlling there, in the OT. Why in OT? Even in operation, even in the OPD, we needed that. We never bothered about it, but every OPD, in fact, if I tell you about my OPD, I don't have windows closed. I don't put ACs on when my OPD is running. I have only respiratory OPD. All my windows are open. There is cross ventilation going on. Every patient who enters my OPD will wear a mask, a simple surgical mask. And most of the times I have that reusable mask, which is cleaned daily, autoclaved daily, and I use it because people carry that mask and throw it on the road. Imagine what kind of biomedical waste we are generating. Imagine what kind of environmental damages we'll do in time to come. I believe most of these OT people, a triple layer surgical mask is enough. Only you are actually operating, only people, only surgeons and anestheticists, probably the main staff will have to wear a N95 mask. Otherwise, those things are not required. In OPD, I don't think we have to wear that entire, what is that called, glass. What that complete face barrier, etc. All that is not needed. How many times you spend more than 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes with your patients in OPD? Average OPD consultation in busy OPD is not 5 minutes here. In those 5 minutes, probably I don't think we need to do all this. I understand we see lot many patients and hence cumulative damage would be more. But how many patients you would see? If you're seeing, say, 100 patients a day, you would see about 10 patients of influenza-like illnesses, of which about 3 or 4 could be corona patient. And if you spend 5 minutes per patient, I think still you have not spent enough time to be defined as close contact for that patient. I understand you would take proper care when you're doing bronchoscopies, when you're doing cough-inducing procedures, when you're intubating a patient, when you're in ICUs and probably a lot of cough is generated there. If there is no negative pressure units available, as I see in most of the hospitals, probably yes, you may have to be careful. But otherwise in OPDs, not required.
But here the issue is the R factor. So it's more contagious. Sir, what is your take, Dr. Hegde?
No, I strongly disagree with you, Agam, because if you look at the mortality, healthcare workers, there's been a significant mortality. And the people who have died have not been intensivists, the people who have died have not been anesthetists. The people who have died have been orthopedic surgeons, cardiac surgeons, general practitioners. It's, and they have died because they haven't taken adequate precautions. I don't think, and one point you said, okay, you can assume that every patient is positive and take precautions. But the mortality on a patient with COVID positive is operated. The patient mortality is more than 30%. Elective surgery, 30% patient mortality. Forget about the risk to the healthcare workers. So at the moment, even for a myocardial infarction, they say don't do a PAMI. If you can do you can certainly no elective surgery because the mortality of the patient, even for elective surgery, is very high. So I would say certainly no elective surgery. Understand emergency surgeries.
So till when would you recommend this?
Orthopedic surgery, laparoscopic surgery, nasopharyngeal surgery. Nasopharyngeal surgery is the highest risk. People have, the entire OT has got. So I don't think we can take it lightly because this is one situation. If you look at the amount of healthcare workers who have died, I think one healthcare worker dying is, the care of so many other people is being affected. I really don't think we can take it that lightly. Agam, I think you are lucky if you haven't got it, but I think what you should learn from the experience of what has happened in the US, what has happened in Italy and other countries, so many healthcare workers have died. I really don't think we should take it, so lightly. I really think this is something that we need to rethink.
What period you would recommend?
Think only emergency surgery you have to do, but you have to take, I agree, but you have to take all full precautions. Intubation is the biggest risk. I agree, the anesthetist and the surgeon are the highest risk. But when you're intubating, everybody else has to leave that area. There should be the minimum number of people in the OT. In fact, they say for half an hour, the OT has to be empty after intubation because the aerosol remains in the OT for about half an hour. After that, the staff can join the OT because intubation is, and after extubation, the same thing happens. Extubation, intubation are dangerous, but you have to take precautions. But the surgeon and the anesthetist, no question, they have to be in full, full gear. There's no question. It may look like it's a waste adding to the cost, but I think at the moment, it is paramount that we try and prevent every healthcare worker from dying because that's an unnecessary death. Somebody getting COVID and dying, unfortunately, this is, destiny or fate or whatever you can say that. Not completely preventable. But an healthcare worker, most of them is a preventable death. I think we should try and, as far as possible, protect the healthcare workers. I think certainly no elective surgery. Emergency surgeries, if you can't do a COVID smear, at least do a HRCT test. The HRCT will tell you at least the high risk of the patient has a COVID pneumonia or not. And even that is not possible. Certainly take full precautions and intubation, extubation, nasopharyngeal surgery, laparoscopic surgery, orthopedic surgery cause the highest risk of aerosolization and need to be, taken seriously. That's my.
For how long will you follow this? For next, 1.5 years?
We have no choice. We don't know. We don't know. Honestly, we don't know. Either that means ultimately, either all of us have to get it. If we get it, there's no problem. If you have our immunity, but the problem is some of them might die. The whole issue is that we don't know who's going to die, who's going to. I mean, the risk is of course to get it and take the chance that you will get it and get over with it. That's fine. But are you willing to take that risk? Because I understand it's the elderly and all that who are more likely, but even young people have died. It's not that young healthcare workers have not died. So we don't know. It's a lottery. I mean, I understand 90% of us will get better, no question. But which that 10% is, nobody knows. Are you willing to take that risk? That's what I'm saying.
Bharat, your views?
Yeah, my view would be same as Dr. Hege's. Even I would go to an extent saying, I have two. One guy is 27-year-old and there's one female with me who's 37-year-old, and they both are very close to the intubation, both on high flow nasal cannula. So even someone say, I'm not suffering from diabetes, I'm not elderly, I don't have an hypertension, I can get away with it. I feel even that assumption is wrong. It's going to affect anyone. And as you rightly said, how long, no one has that answer. And as I was saying, once you get infection, you get away with it. So there have been reports of reinfection. And there have been reports of, I don't know how long the herd immunity is going to help. So my next question would be, is herd immunity is going to be there? Is it going to help us? Or once you get an infection, you will not get it? Is there an assurity of that kind? Dr. Hege, will you continue with that?
About reinfection, Bharat, about reinfection, I think those things have not been, because that was PCR being positive. PCR can be positive for a couple of months. It is like for TB, we say PCR being positive means nothing. The same thing applies for COVID. I don't think a repeat PCR positive means that you got reinfected or means that you got a relapse. So that is out. I don't think, we don't know what will happen after 1 year, whether immunity will last for up to a year. But in short term, I don't think there's a risk of reinfection relapse. Long term, we don't know.
Herd immunity probably with the R0 of about 4, fairly infective. There are various calculations, whatever hypothetical calculations we have, make us feel that we need to have about 55 to 75, and some calculations say that about 90% of the community getting infected and surviving. Then probably, by then the herd immunity will come in place. And
the idea is that we're hoping that the rate of infection is so slow that our hospitals can cope. That's all. Ultimately, we all are going to get it. We are only hoping that the rate of infection is slowed down to a level there that the ICUs in the city can cope. That's about all. That's the only thing we can do.
In absence of vaccine, herd immunity will take even longer. And if we wait for that particular path, that means herd immunity, say about 50% of the population to get infected, if you give by lowest possible figure, and of which, that means out of about 138 crore, what we're talking about, 70 crores should get infected. And then if you look at the standard mortality, about 5%, if you really go by that 5%, we'll have to lose crores of life if we follow the herd immunity path. So I think that's going to be dangerous. But if you look at the other ways, we have nothing else. Unless you probably, you think, Dr. Hegde, we are going to be in this lockdown for even longer time. I doubt that even few weeks of more lockdown would kill more people because of starvation, because of stress, because of various other diseases than COVID.
There is, I agree. There's no answer. I agree with you. There's no answer. I don't know what the answer is. All I'm trying to say is that
I think, there is more fear with this media. Tell me how many times you report each death because of myocardial infarction. Tell me how many times you report each death because of tuberculosis.
There has been a situation where the dead bodies are lining up. There's never been a situation where dead bodies are lining up anywhere. There's never been a situation. So obviously the mortality has gone higher. We have had.
Let me again argue on this. See, if you really look by death numbers.
No, that's what I'm saying. Whenever have you seen dead bodies piling up everywhere? Not just, forget about Bombay, but New York, Italy, dead bodies piling up everywhere.
No, I'm not talking about international. I'm talking about my nation.
Mortality has gone up. Whatever mortality to other things have come down, no question. But
2019 total deaths are far more than 2020 April total deaths.
No, but those are, what I'm trying to tell you is that those were deaths due to long-term, morbidity. I don't know, but I don't think
2020 is yet to be finished. I mean, 6 months more left.
Sorry?
2026.
My point is that if it really that much low, why are our ICUs
only 1 month?
If that is the case, why are our ICUs full? Why are we getting beds, phone calls every day for beds? Why are we trying to create more beds? If it is not the
there's so much of fear. All these nursing homes with one positive patient.
ICU is full. Bharat's ICU is full. Everybody's ICU is full. We're not imagining.
What I was going to come with, what you're saying is right. Maybe the number is gone, but if you see I have never seen kind of a situation where my ICU is full with just one disease. So always my ICU has been full, sir's ICU has been full, but it has been a varied disease. Now it's
Again,
just
I disagree. You know, kya hua hai, Ashit bhai? Bharat bhai, what has happened? No hospitals are admitting patients. I would have lost at least 5 patients where beds are not given. Most of these hospitals, ICUs are empty. Hospitals are empty, but there is a fear of taking this patient. Half the hospital staffs are not there. There are so many issues. We are not talking about corporate big hospitals. I'm talking of all the small hospitals which were giving health care to huge kind of population here suddenly have collapsed.
So I'll come to the next question now. That is what is summer is going to help us, or if we go other way around, or maybe we will see the bigger wave when the winter comes in. And
Yes.
do we have to live with Corona forever?
Yes, for sure. For sure. Since Ashit bhai is busy on phone, I'll take up this question again. See, social distancing, probably it was done last couple of months. We invested in creating enough infrastructure to face the real scene. Real scene to kya bolte hai? If I have to tell you in Shah Rukh Khan style, picture to abhi baki hai mere dost. You know, we are going to see far more number of cases in next few weeks. The minute you open this lockdown, you're going to have these cases.
So, sir, are we going to see more cases as the winter comes in? We are protected because of summer, and do we have to live with Corona forever?
Nobody knows, na Bharat. Your guess is as good as mine. We don't know how it will behave. So we really don't know whether, like the MERS came, SARS-2 came, the immunity lasted. We don't know what will happen next year. It's really, that is your guess is as good as mine. I don't want to make any,
If we
predictions
go
are
by
difficult.
previous
Any
experiences,
tips for the nursing home owners? How do they do it? How do they go about it? Or how long they have to be shut if they open it? Then how to do it? Any tips for them? That is what the next question is. Yeah.
No. Basically, your worries about getting your nursing home getting shutting down and your getting your quarantine of your healthcare workers. So basically, if you look at it, you qualify as a low risk. You don't want to be a high risk or moderate risk, contact. If you're a low risk contact, by and large, you can continue to work. Your nursing home is not shut down. So basically, I think the most important thing is, as Agam also said, that you have to wear a mask. It doesn't necessarily have to be an N95 mask. It has to be a AAA surgical mask, and you have to make sure that everybody you come in contact with also has a surgical mask. Other thing is also that the mucosa, your eyes have to be protected. So either you need to wear goggles or you need to wear the visor. So if your eyes and your nasal passages are protected, and the person who's potentially infected is also wearing a mask, then you become a low risk suspect. Obviously, you also need to do surface cleaning of your nursing home at least 2 or 3 times a day with bleach. So if you've done all these things, then even by chance, if some patient turns out to be positive, by and large, your nursing home is not going to be closed down. By and large, none of your staff will be, sent into quarantine. So important things are just AAA surgical mask, protection of the eyes, either with a goggle or a visor. A visor should be a non-vented visor. I mean, the air should not go in front of your eyes. The visor should have a foam or some sponge in between your forehead and the eyes. Wearing gloves, hand washing before and after each patient contact, and surface cleaning 3 or 4 times a day. That should be enough. By and large, if we go by this, there is no major risk to you or your nursing home or your staff. That's what I think you could follow.
There are small manageable air handling units available. There are small ultraviolet rays filters available, and those ultraviolet systems can be installed. If I can show you, I have one system here installed in my, I don't know whether it is seen. You can see that light in a corner. I tried taking camera there. This has got auto timer. So every day evening, once I close my clinic at midnight, it starts and it is on for about 4 hours. It is there in the OPD waiting area as well. It doesn't cost much. The air handling unit that we get costs somewhere in thousands, for a smaller clinic, standalone clinics. And those instruments can be put. In fact, IMA has come out with a very nice document on how to take care of your clinic and whether you need to really use sodium hypochlorite solution, and if so, in what concentrations. And even I maybe yesterday had a meeting with API, Association of Physicians of India, has also prepared a document which is in the final stage of review, and that also will be available in time to come. So we have enough guidelines available. Being a chest physician, allow me to tell you, if you have taken care in your OPD for tuberculosis, that is enough for your coronavirus patient management, enough for your any respiratory virus or any respiratory disease infection management. I told you simple things you have to follow. Keep windows open. See to it that there is adequate ventilation. What Ashit bhai said, you have to understand the hand hygiene. Clean your stethoscopes frequently. Keep distance with your patient. Don't examine them very closely, and learn telemedicine. Probably it is a time where we start doing teleconsultations. I started teleconsultation about a year ago. mainly when it came to MDR and XDR tuberculosis patients. So what I would do is I would call patients' relatives to come with their file, with their X-ray, with their newer sputum reports, and I would talk to patients on phone. And we started it in a very small way, only for restricted disease, that is MDR and XDR tuberculosis, because they could spread disease in my OPD. You have 15-20 patients sitting in your OPD, and one patient of MDR and XDR tuberculosis could be threat to a lot of patients there. And probably I have started doing it now in this times, this unprecedented time, where a lot of your stable patients can be managed on phone when it comes to making small adjustments in their medicine. So probably it is a time we probably change our practices. But then yes, we have to start working. We can't not work. We can't really shut down and probably wait for this epidemic to get over. Unmute.
Yeah, sorry. When you're talking about the nursing home, so what is your take on installing the central air condition as well? So how do we?
Central air condition is a problem. Central air condition is a problem because you cannot have air exchanges in the central air condition. Central air condition actually recirculates the air which is inside. So you have to have air handling unit with central air conditions, or if you can do that, keep windows open with your AC on. That's all that I can tell you. All those who have window ACs could have their vent. I think there are systems available where you can allow the air exchange happening, like what we have in car. You could probably allow outside air to come, and probably, when you do not want that, you want more, is you could shut that, and probably internal air could move. So similarly, a central air condition has their set of problems, but window ACs are fine. If you have central air condition, see to it that your windows are open.
Sir, Dr. Ashit, what do we do? We stay in a corporate hospital and we all have a central AC. So what is the option with us?
For our build, honestly, for us, we are lucky. We moved to another building, but didn't have central AC. So that's we didn't face that problem. We didn't have. We moved to another building across the road, which has.
But you're never sure, no, what kind of patient you get over there. You might get an inadvertent exposure.
But like that, it's impossible for us to take care of every possibility. We do what you take common sense. You do what you can, but some people are going to slip through the net. I don't think you can take care of every eventuality.
We're going to get it.
Like I said, even if you've been exposed, if you have done these few things like using a mask, etc., I think you're okay. But for a central AC is a difficult bit. I mean, you can create negative pressure rooms by using exhaust, etc. But central pressure, because what we did when we had an ICU, which was the central AC, we had to cut off the AC to that wing because the BMC said that you can't. So, but the other thing is that, of course, that COVID-19 is essentially droplet, not aerosol. Central AC is really a bigger problem if you have an aerosol. If you don't have a droplet, for aerosols, definitely for like chicken pox and measles, etc., aerosol is a bigger problem. That's why central AC was a bigger problem. Here, except when you're doing an aerosol generating procedure, by and large, it's more droplet. Central AC, though in theory can cause problems, it's not as big a problem as it was for MERS and SARS too. So I think
but then
not
in
as
that
big
case,
a problem. But certainly possible. Obviously, windows and open ventilation is definitely better.
No,
but
what you could do is there are special HME units available. Those HME filters available. You could think of using those HME filters with ionizers. So it has a double technology engine, and it could take care of your N95 mask kind 0.3 microns particles. And the particulate matter it can clean out. Again, it depends on the kind of area you have, kind of patient load you have, kind of air exchanges that are happening in that room. One could think of putting HME filters. In fact, a lot of TB units, TB OPDs in municipal hospitals have got this kind of units installed.
It's more of an engineering solution, not really. It's more of an engineering solution, I think.
Yes.
Really
but you have to learn to live it in there. Imagine Cooper Hospital, what else do you expect in my TB OPD? There are 50 patients sitting and everybody's coughing. Where you're going to explain, at least Corona taught them about cough hygiene and everybody's wearing mask. Ab tak kahan koi mask pehen ke nahi aata tha, all TB OPDs are like that only.
That's why your TB death rates have come down, no? That's why.
TB rates have... That is also very interesting thing here. Ashit, I'm writing one article on this. TB deaths TB probably management is going to suffer in next 2 to 3 months. You will see again a big surge of TB also. क्या हो रहा है? TB की medicine नहीं मिल रही है, TB का reporting नहीं हो रहा है, gene expert नहीं हो रहा है. There are issues with it. With lockdown, patients cannot travel to get their free medicines. Notification of tuberculosis has gone down again significantly. One more problem that
incidents would come down, no? because everyone is wearing masks. There are cough
नहीं,
etiquette followed.
नहीं,
Relapse,
नहीं, अगर
relapse
2
is
महीने
talking
से
relapse.
2 महीने का care से TB was to go down, then we would have conquered this disease long ago. 150 years and we have not 150 years of clear understanding of what disease is and what medicines work on it. We have not able to control it. तो 1-2 महीने का मास्क से क्या होने वाला है?
Then
In
you
fact,
can जाएंगे शायद, but relapse
in
होने
fact, a
वाला
lot of people are in the house. There are going to be more cases in the house. You will see contact tuberculosis probably rising. You will see their drug resistant level rising. क्योंकि next 2-3 months तक medicine नहीं जाएगा, will lead to a lot of irregularities and probably that will rise. I'm writing that article. Notification, TB notification also has gone down in 1 month's time. Imagine.
And what is your take on the nutrition? And do vitamin C, zinc, all these things help, or
Ashit. Ashit will answer.
See, I mean, I'm not sure again, but it's very popular. There were few studies which talked about vitamin C for sepsis, etc. So zinc, of course, for viral infections, people talked about zinc. So they're potentially harmless, So I honestly, that's the only thing we give: vitamin C and zinc to the patients who have, COVID. But if you ask me whether they work, I don't know. But the isolated reports. But essentially, because they're harmless drugs, probably will not do any major harm. We give them, but I can't say they're definitely beyond doubt useful. But certainly, almost everybody who gets vitamin C and Zincovit in our.
People are very skeptical about HCQs. People are very skeptical about azithromycin. But when it comes to vitamin C and vitamin D and everything, people are very happy about it. So I think that factor also plays very.
About QT prolongation, all that, nothing else, and they're not very expensive. I agree.
किधर यार किधर कोई QT मुझे तो याद ही नहीं last 20 years I've seen any QT prolongation.
No, sir.
Azithromycin plus HCQ.
Yes, I understand.
So next question was this only. So do we go ahead with the HCQ and HZ prophylaxis, and
yes.
We just stop
I will tell you what I do. I don't know what I'm doing is right, but this is what I'm doing. I have taken HCQ and I have told all my medical friends to take HCQs, and I've forced them to give. And in fact, I see to it that every time when I take it, they also take it. So probably there is enough literature now which says that probably HCQ prophylaxis doesn't really work. And most of us, it is, to my mind, it is secondary prophylaxis, not primary prophylaxis. In the sense, HCQ will not let those viruses enter your body. But once your virus enters your body, probably the development of disease may not take place. That is what is the idea of taking this HCQ. I got my basic baseline ECG done. There was no QT prolongation. That's what a cardiologist friend told me, because I don't know how to calculate that QT interval. And probably once it was there, then since there are not many contraindications, I took it. And probably this is the 6th week that I'm taking it. That's what it is. Azithromycin I have not taken, no. And I would strongly recommend that all medical professionals must take influenza vaccine and must take pneumococcal vaccine. I will take this opportunity to convey this message. I'm a great fan of adult immunization. And I think probably it would be absolutely criminal on my part if I'm not able to convey the message of adult immunization to my colleagues. So I would want all doctors to vaccinate themselves for influenza and pneumonia for sure.
So there was an article on the OPV as well, because being an RNA, they thought it will be kind of a herd immunity, and they had advised everyone to take few drops of OPV. So,
what difficult question, Dr. Hegde?
OPV as of this against corona?
They said it's an RNA virus, so it might have a cross immunity. You just
a few drops of the virus itself, like oral polio.
Yes, sir.
No, I think one must take 2 pegs of alcohol FDA so that it would probably clear all those viruses from system. I think that would be far beneficial than. No, I think I have not read it. I read about BCG vaccine and its effects on corona. I think it is more of observation than anything else. But then there are some hypotheses which has come up, and probably
speculation because they were studying why is it not coming up in India. Now, obviously, that speculation is gone.
But abroad, the mortality among Indians is higher than the local, so BCG can't be protecting. A lot of the Indians who died, a lot of people died in the UK have been Indians who have got BCG. So I don't think that hypothesis.
No, I think India has definitely a different pattern, whether you believe it or not. And probably, there are many factors which are responsible. In fact, in API, we were looking at various aspects. And I think, imagine apna Hindu or probably, traditional culture, if you see, we don't generally eat with fork and spoon. We generally eat with our hand. We wash our hands before eating. We wash our hands after eating. We don't like to take our shoes inside. The current trend, bachche aajkal shoes leke bedroom tak. We still have a habit of removing shoes outside and then entering. Probably we would when even while after using toilets, we don't use tissue paper. We use hand and probably we clean hands after using washrooms. There are so many issues. Even a smallest event, and you see 25 and 50 people gathering in our place. We have always believed in crowd. The immunities are different. We do Ganga Snan with 1 crore Indians at a time. We do langar food with about 10,000 people sitting next to you. In a smallest festival, you see 100,000 people gathering together. There is definitely something which is protecting you from the otherwise same disease, same time. Why the numbers are so less in our country? Why mortality is probably not as bad as we anticipated? I think
as bad is not been seen because when we are working, mortality is bad. If you see the scenario and without quoting any of the hospitals in somewhere around in Bombay, mortality is quite high. It's just lockdown was helping us. Now it's gone beyond our control. And whatever assumptions we had about this herd immunity, cross immunity, all those are to be proven wrong. This is what my reading is. Because if you see the
a lot
surges,
of people feel that way. Yeah, what you're saying is right.
all those things will be proven wrong, and we'll see enough number of cases to prove these things wrong.
True.
So mortality is coming up, people are getting infected. And about the HCQs, not from my hospital, but I know around 40-45 healthcare workers who are on HCQs and are suffering from the corona disease. So in my personal opinion, I am on 6th week, but obviously it's not working. I'll continue taking it, but it's not working anymore.
Bhai ne kya kiya? Hey, Ashit bhai, have you taken HCQ?
So I was talking, at least I know 40 of the healthcare workers, not from my hospital, who are suffering from the disease, and they all were on the HCQ prophylaxis. And they all
I was among the first people who were quarantined, among the first patients in Bombay. Among the first patients in Bombay was my patient. So I was quarantined 15. I have not taken HCQ. Of course, I mean, I'm elderly, but still I weighed the pros and cons. I did not take it. Until a week ago, our hospital used to give HCQ prophylaxis to every staff member who was supposed the front line. From last week, we have stopped even that. That now, if you want, it's up to you. You can take it on your own, but we are not offering prophylaxis anybody. So I don't. We will have a kind of a study because now we have patients. We have staff members who have got HCQ, and we have got staff members who don't have. So we can actually do kind of a study and see what happens right now. But I agree with you, Agam. Theoretically, it may not prevent you from acquiring the disease, but it might theoretically modify the disease. It might make it milder. We don't know. But it will not prevent you, sir. Bharat, it will not prevent you from
it's not even milder.
Hmm.
Theoretically, it might make it milder. Theoretically, that's only rational.
It's not even milder. Now, the moment they're opening up, we are seeing in last 15 days, I have seen many severe cases. I mean,
I agree with you. So that's it. We have stopped using HCQ now.
What's the hospital policy there, Bharat bhai? In your hospital, what do we do for healthcare providers?
Initially, we used to advise and offer it to everyone, and now we have stopped it. So it's been offered but not advised. If someone wants to take it, hospital will bear the cost, but obviously we don't go and say now take it, which we were doing a few days back.
Interesting.
Second was also need to talk about the walk test. As I was saying, the people who are suffering from the disease and are at home, if the saturation is 95, is less than 95, they should be hospitalized. So do the walk test have a role over there? Ashit sir.
What has a role?
Walk test.
Walk test, that way. But how do you monitor the saturation? You have to monitor the 6 minute saturation.
Someone who's staying at home and the saturation is less than 95, that is the case who should be hospitalized. Otherwise, you can stay back home, if the numbers are going up,
No, but that means you still need a pulse oximeter when they're desaturating on walking. So, that might be, I mean, I agree that might be oversensitive. The only question is that how many of them actually gone. Some people are doing that, but I don't know whether you're then going to overdiagnose the whole thing. I personally, you're right. In people where home pulse oximetry is not possible, maybe that might be a better option. But I honestly, like I said, I see after they've done all that, so I really don't know. Maybe you might be able to tell you, maybe Agam might be able to tell you.
What we do is in the ward, we have the big number, and in the ICU is also kind of full. So the patients who are borderline, who look sick, but we are still comfortable in the ward, we kind of do walk test pre-saturation before walking and after walking. If it falls really down less than 90, we've seen the figures, somewhere it was 95 and after 5 minutes of walk, it was 78. Those are the patients we wheel in down because we are kind of constrained in a space, so we choose whom to get down and whom to stay back because everyone looks sick.
Wheel them down when they actually desaturate. Now, why do you have to wheel them earlier? You monitor for pulse ox regularly. How does it matter?
The numbers are big and monitoring regularly becomes kind of difficult. So there we have to judge it somewhere. So it might happen. So, okay, I missed the regular monitoring. So in the morning rounds, we make it a rule. Someone who is borderline and looking sick, we do a walk test and then we decide what is to be done. So this is how we choose the patients, preventing the catastrophic desaturation. As you said, it's a happy hypoxia patient doesn't realize this unless and until they are very bad. And this is also the point. Someone who's come to us, conversion from mild to moderate to severe is hardly been there. I can just count 2 or 3 patients on my fingers. So someone who comes to us in timely manner, I believe they do well. But someone who's come to us severe, it's severe. So timely intervention, what kind of intervention? I don't know. Maybe the simple oxygen, as Dr. Hegde said, or maybe the just an anticoagulation helps it. So one more question: you anticoagulate each and every patient, even if the mild patient or just the ICU patients you're talking about?
ICU patient. I'm talking about ICU. I don't look after the patients in the mild ward, but in the ICU, everybody gets LMWH, not the regular one, not the home. Only the ICU. Once they shift to the ICU, everybody gets LMWH, and then we monitor D-dimer alternate day. If it's climbing, then of course we might give therapeutic. Not in the the other ward is looked after by the respiratory people, so I don't know what they do. I don't think they give them LMWH routinely because many of them are quite ambulatory and all that. I don't think they get. But ICU, everybody gets.
So plasma therapy, sir, you already covered in your talk. So just your, is there any personal experience?
No, we were because it's a, like I said, we can't give it without permission at the moment. It has to be only part of a trial. Our hospital has approved for IRB approval, so until it is approved, we can't use it in our hospital. So probably by next week we may be able to, because I don't think you can use it outside of a trial. That's what I think.
Dr. Agam, last question for you. I think we almost coming to close it, and maximum questions have been covered. Again, you have answered this, I know, but the other question which has come up: every COPD patient who are being on steroids, should they be continuing with the steroids, or you suggest them to stop it?
Yes, they should be on the same standard dose. But then, trust me, if you really follow the current guidelines, there is hardly any role of oral steroid when it comes to COPD. Inhaled steroids, probably some inhaled steroids leads to higher incidences of pneumonia, and hence probably the whole thought process came that one patient is stable, you can withdraw inhaled steroids. If patient is on steroids for whatever reasons, due to corona, you will not change it. You will continue line of treatment as it is. If you have a suspicion of infection in these patients, then avoid nebulization so far as possible, because nebulization would generate a lot of aerosol, and then you may have to probably advise them regarding care. And what happens is, lot of patients wear masks when they go outside, but when they are at home, they don't prefer to wear masks. Especially in my cabin also, they would wear mask in the waiting room, but the minute they come to you, they would want to remove their mask and would want to talk to you. Or even worse, they would want to cough and show you how they cough. So that is even worse. I many times pray God, thank God I'm not gastroenterologist and they are not suffering from loose motion. Otherwise, God knows what they would have done in front of me. But then, thank God, I'm a chest physician, so probably in a better position. But I think those small things one has to be a little careful. Otherwise, continue same treatment as it is.
Ashit sir, so what overall we come to the discharge policy now. So what do you practice?
Unfortunately, we have to follow the discharge policy laid down by the government. I don't think these policies have been thought about. I don't think they're rational. First of all, we come to the quarantine policy. Quarantine policy is supposed to be 14 days. There is no rationale. Basically, you quarantine somebody to prevent them from spreading infection to others. It has been clearly shown that by day 5, if your PCR is negative, then you're very, very unlikely to then become symptomatic and spread it to others. So I think, honestly, if you're a higher or moderate suspect, you should be tested on day 5 or day 6. If your throat swab is negative, then you can safely return to work. We have been trying to persuade the authority to change the quarantine guidelines, because 14 days staff being sent, there's a tremendous shortage of healthcare workers in all hospitals. And sometimes there are times when a nurse comes back and 2 days later again she's sent on quarantine. This is becoming madness. I think somebody has to think about this quarantine policy and try and shorten it. Second thing comes to discharge policy. Again, nobody has thought about. The CDC, NHS, everybody has said that after 9 days, it's very, very unlikely that you will be transmitting the virus to others in the community. Your PCR may take time to become negative. Like we know for TB, your gene expression being positive doesn't mean that they're still contagious. The same rule should apply to COVID-19. Your RT-PCR may remain positive up to a month. It doesn't mean anything. By and large, by 9 or 10 days of symptoms, you are no longer shedding the virus. You're no longer risk to others. So by and large, if you're asymptomatic and well, ideally 10 days from the onset of symptoms, you should be discharged. You should no longer be quarantined. Unfortunately, our authorities said that you need 7 more days of quarantine, which may be okay for other people. But for healthcare workers, 17 days again puts a lot of stress on the healthcare institutions. I really think somebody needs to rethink these guidelines. I don't agree with them completely, but at the moment, unfortunately, I have to follow them because that is what the recommendations are.
The same
I
is
would
true.
say,
Same is true for someone who's being intubated when we do tracheostomy 10 days down the line or 12 days down the line.
no, they say they have to be PCR negative because they probably have a higher viral load, etc. They've been sicker, so maybe there you probably need to be off oxygen for at least 3 days. Your PCR need to be there. I can understand, but that's a very, very small subset, probably less than 5%. 95% of people, I don't think it matters.
So I think we are coming to end of it. We answer the maximum questions and whatever is possible. Dr. Arun, to you now.
Sir, before we close this interesting webinar, I would like you to reflect upon your experience since you have been taking care of more than 150 patients suffering from this disease. We would like to know from you very briefly what has been your experience, sir.
No, I think everything has been covered in this talk. Whatever we spoke was on my experience, and sir is also, everyone is treating the patients. So only difference, as I shared my experiences, we are seeing now more numbers, and in last few days maybe the sicker patients are coming to us, and the reason being maybe because it's now a taboo. Many patients are not coming out, and they've realized it's milder in most of the disease. So there are many patients who have fever, they are staying back home. So initially it was quite a bit of fear and panicky. Simple sneeze and cough patients were coming in, but now those simple sneeze and cough, they're staying back because they know they will be quarantined for 14 days. So they are not reporting. And what we have now is more of the sicker patients. And as rightly said, there's no specific treatment available. So what is required is good care, good intensive care, supportive care for the patients, follow the basics and just treat them. This is what is required. Sir, you would like to add anything to it?
No. You said it. Like I said, just there's nothing new. We just do what you're always doing, nothing new. Nothing.
Corona taught us many new things. Corona taught me that I can live without maids and without drivers. Corona taught me that I can live without Swiggy and I can live without eating Domino's. Corona taught me that I can be a good cook, I can be a good husband, I can spend time with family. Corona taught me my daughter is a cheat yaar. अरे यार वो लूडो खेलते हैं हर बार cheating करती है and then probably every time she wins. How is that possible? So Corona is teaching me not many new things. Corona taught me to thank everybody by folding hands rather than shaking hands. So I thank all of you for sparing valuable time. I thank Arun for giving us the platform. Bharat bhai, you did this program so well. I think
One
it was
last
smarter
question
than
for
ever we
Dr.
are doing
Hegde.
program.
One last question for Dr. Hegde. It's actually my question. Sir, your take on early versus delayed intubation?
No, I don't think anything is early was a delayed. If they require intubation, they require intubation. I think all that is nonsense.
We don't, the way people are pushing it, delaying it, and just
that's why people die because the intubation delayed. Obviously, you try and
Mortality
avoid
is more.
intubation. But if there's sign of respiratory fatigue, if the sternocleidomastoid is acting, there is diaphragmatic paradox. I don't think there's any point in you trying any stunts. You better intubate them. Obviously, you try first with your HFN or NIV or whatever else you want to do. But if it's not succeeding, I don't think you should delay it beyond. You can give a trial of non-invasive and all that, but certainly beyond a year or two, I think the indications of intubation should be the same. I don't think. And the main thing is, I realize that you probably don't need to use high PEEP. I think what is happening is that people are using very high PEEP, which is probably not required. You probably can use low PEEPs. You probably need to prone them as soon as early as possible. And you can probably get away with a slightly higher tidal volume than you use for ARDS, because here the lung is not like a baby lung. It's probably more compliant. So maybe I would use a higher tidal volume, but I would not delay intubation with them. In fact, we realized that in the first couple of patients, we probably delayed intubation, they died. There are other patients, now we have learned a lesson, we're intubating them early. In fact, we've extubated a few patients, so it's not such a big deal.
so is it there has been incidences and there have been cases where they say the patient are deteriorating again, or it's seen in all the ARDSs. Usually they do well and sometimes, so it's the same kind of a thing. Which is
Secondary infection, probably. I don't think it's relapse of the primary infection. It could be secondary bacterial pneumonia, or like you say, sometimes you have aspergillus. So many things happening. So I don't think that necessarily means it's a relapse of the original virus.
tocilizumab.
That's what I meant. So if people that makes you more vulnerable to secondary bacterial infections. So in them you have to worry. Actually, if they deteriorate again, you worry about secondary infections.
So have you been using it?
No, not so far. Not so far. We are a very conservative hospital, as you know.
Methylpred?
Huh?
Methylpred?
Methylpred, like I said, as a policy, if their saturations are dropping after 1 week, then we use not more than 1 mg per kilogram. Not more than 1 mg per kilogram.
But ventilation, yes.
Yeah.
On ventilator, yes.
Certainly. No, before there is a ventilator. Even HFN also we would use it.
All right. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah. So we'll close the session for now. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Dr. Agam, sir. Thank you. As always, it's been good to talking to you.
Agam, sir.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Ashit. Bye.